right. So what I'm going to do now is get to the hands-on part of it. I'll try to go slow, but if you find any difficulty, we have some people in Postman t-shirts across the floor. Uh, can two of you just split, just make sure you cover either side? So if you're stuck in something small where it's not working or something, reach out to these people, wave at them, they'll come and help you. And so what we will do next is look at the API design process from the producer's perspective, which in a way is where the API process begins, because once you have a requirement, you draw up specifications and you design it, you start building it, and then the consumer part kicks in. In reality, however, especially with software teams, you have multiple teams working in parallel. And especially when we talk agile, we are not talking of the waterfall model where the consumer can only start once the producer has actually shipped out at least a staging version of it. Sorry. So what we are going to do is create this collection that we will use as a blueprint, and we will add requests to it, requests which will map to how the hypothetical API that I'm talking of is going to be. We will look at the documentation aspect of it, and this is where I would like to emphasize that we of course call this as a very good practice if you have an OpenAPI schema, or if you have some sort of executable schema as part of your API's design. But at times, some teams, especially in terms of digital transformation, where you are moving legacy systems to new age things, you kind of get stuck in this process of learning about the schema, working with it. So at the bare minimum, if you don't have the capacity or the time to actually work on a schema, like start with a schema, at least start with a documentation. And as difficult as it sounds, writing documentation for API is actually pretty easy. So I'll show you how you can actually do that. And we'll also look at adding example responses as part of the requests themselves, which again feed into the documentation, they feed into mocks. And we'll look at the workspace aspect of collaboration as well as the commenting that I mentioned. So what I have here, if I close the launchpad, I'm running the Canary version in here just to show you that how this is going to look like. So at the top, is my mouse cursor visible to everyone? Yeah. Okay, so at the top, this is the workspace selector. So I'm in a team workspace, and I have this workspace called cat management. It can be anything for you. So by the way, this is something new coming in Postman. How many of you actually have long list of workspaces that you use? Yeah, we are getting a search in there finally. Coming out soon. Yeah, so what we will be building today is going to end up looking somewhat like this. Like in a workspace, we'll have 2 collections by the end of the day. And the first collection that we'll work on is the blueprint, which will initially start with these 2 requests. So the get all cats and add a new cat. And I'll just give a quick rundown of the Postman interface at this point. So the left-hand side thing is what we call as the sidebar, which lists your history, collections, and APIs, which is slightly new in terms of Postman. On the right-hand side, you have the build view, the actual builder. So these are the requests in a tab. And you have the URL, you have comments up here, examples as well. Oh, comments have moved, yes. And you have the params, authorization, headers, and the pre-request script and tests option. And then when you send a request, let's see, internet. Here we go. I selected a wrong one. But anyway, I at least have some response. Because my hypothetical API is api.cat, and that website doesn't exist. So, so this is how the response looks like. And you can also define your body. So this is the request body on the top. At the bottom is the response. Two pane is not going to work here. Single pane view is better. And the things in those squiggly brackets here are variables. So what you see as underscore cat name, underscore cat breed, I'm actually creating variables in the body itself. So I'll show you more around that. And what we'll have is, like I said, the blueprint collection is where you have, sorry. The blueprint collection represents how your API would look like. So this is how the web documentation looks like. In case of Postman, this is auto-generated from your collection. So you don't have to write any of these. What you're seeing now is only viewable to members of this team, and members of this workspace, if it is not a private workspace. So even if you share this URL to someone else, they won't be able to view it unless they are part of the team. But if they are part of the team, they can just use the dashboard and look at everything. And the documentation, whatever thing you see here, is generated directly from the collection data itself. So the body that I have, the examples that I have, everything is generated from there. And then we'll be creating this API schema in Postman. I'll run you through. So this is the OpenAPI schema in there. And I have like multiple versions of it created. So I'll run through the versioning as well. And like, by the end of the whole thing, we'll have mocks, we'll have this API, we'll have a blueprint collection and a contract collection from a consumer's perspective with some tests in there. So I'm going to close this, and I'm going to start fresh. I have the stable version of Postman right now. So just to make sure that everyone's on the same version, I'm on 7.6.0 of Postman, which you can see by clicking the Postman if you're on Mac, or you can go to help about in Windows, I think. And just make sure that you are at least on 7.5 or 7.6 if it's not updated. All right. So, sorry? You will have to use the app if you want to build it along with me. The browser would come in certain places where we would look at the results of things. Okay. So I have got an empty workspace, but let me just create a new workspace for us to start with. So let me take a step back. So I'm going to the workspace tab here. I'm switching to team. I might not need to do that, but I'm doing the create new workspace. And I'm creating a team workspace. If you have your team members sitting here, you can create a free account if you don't have a team already, and you can invite them there, so you get to see the workspaces in action. So let's call it, let's say, cat management API. And one of the ways we organize workspaces ourselves at Postman, because we use Postman a lot in our engineering practices as well. So one of the ways to organize these workspaces would be by function. Let's say if you have a sales, marketing, developer relations, or if you have, if your engineering team is using it, it might be every different service that you have that can have a workspace of its own. And that way you can group together your collections and just share them with a set of people. So I'm going to skip the summary, but you can add it here. So there is my workspace. So now I'm part of this team workspace. I don't have anything created in this. So the first thing I'll do is go and create a collection. Now you can create a collection from the sidebar here, or you can click the new on top and click collection. So let's call this, I'm going to call it cat management blueprint. And just again, to kind of avoid any kind of confusion, what I'm referring to as a blueprint collection is just a collection that I'm using as a reference collection for my API's documentation and overall reference. So I have given a name, and then you see the description field in there. And I told you that I will tell you about documentation. So this is where it starts. This description field is where you can write Markdown. And that Markdown gets rendered as part of the documentation that is generated at the beginning. If you use heading once in Markdown, that creates different sections. So one of the common things that we do is maybe just describe what this collection is. Let's say, I'm just going to make it very obvious. And what you'll notice is that I'm actually not touching any code at any point, as in I'm not going to go into development, but just show you how the development process might work together. And a very common thing that we often find is, especially in terms of APIs, is people actually need to sign up with your system to be able to access it, like get the API keys or whatever authentication mechanism they need. Now, that is not something, as of now, we can do automatically. So we'd still need to tell your consumers that, hey, go here, sign up for an account, get the API key, come back and put it here. So that kind of information is what you can add here. So I can just say, go to getpostman.com and sign up. Though in this case, it won't be. You can add whatever. Now, collections also have these authorization and pre-request tests and variables. I'm not going to go deep into that, except when I showed you that variables diagram and there was a collection scope, this is the collection scope for the variables. So whatever you define here gets stored as part of the collection itself. That is, if you export the collection as a JSON, send it to someone, these variables would retain whatever you see. Now, one important thing I want to highlight about variables that you would see in environments as well as collections is you have a variable name. So let's say I want to call it URL, which can be the base URL. And then you see two columns, initial value and current value. The initial value column is the content that is stored in the collection or synced to other users or through Postman sync service. So let's say I just write example.com because I'm using a placeholder. And the current value overrides the initial value but is only stored locally. So the usefulness of this is you might have certain values which you don't want to be synchronized or shared with others, even if you accidentally publish the collection or export the collection. So let's say I have my let's say I have something running on localhost 9001. That's my dev server. So I would want to point it there. And another common use case is, let's say I have my API keys or passwords that we often need to use when we are working with APIs. So if you have something like that and you're building a collection, do not put the actual key in the initial value. You can just put a placeholder thing here and your actual, which, yeah, that's a pretty strong API key there. So your API keys or passwords, keep them in the current value column always, unless you are running monitors. Now, not necessarily always, it's actually safe to have these in your initial value, but just to make sure that those environments are not shared with people outside. OK, so now that I have a description written, I have some variables declared here. Let's create the collection.
So you mean the current value will not get shared when
The current value does not get shared.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so it stays local to that computer.
Okay.
All right, so I now have a collection which is empty. I don't have any request in it. And the next thing that I would want to do is actually create a request and save it into that collection. Now, you have multiple ways that you can do it. Let's say the simplest way would be I start writing a request here. And if you remember, one of the things that I wanted as part of the requests, the request bit was adding a get/cats. And what I did here is I used a variable as the base URL of the request. And what this will let you do, and this is a very common practice that we use in defining APIs, is you use the base URL as a variable, And then you can use environments. You can just inject different values, make it point to different servers. So the same server might be hosted locally when you're developing, might be hosted on a staging environment for testing, might be deployed to production. But the code base running it would essentially be the same. So you can use a variable here. And since didn't I create a collection variable called URL? But that was a trick question to myself. I was like, what happened here? Thank you. So this is actually not associated with any collection right now. So let's do one thing. Let's save it. So I just have created get/cats, and I hit Control S, and it shows up this pop-up, save request. Now, the request description, the request name is very important when you are describing a request. It's important for others to understand and for you to understand as well. You can, of course, write whatever you want here, but let's say I want something more descriptive, and I say the request name is get all cats, and the request description, again, takes Markdown, so you can also write interesting things there. What I would write here is gets a list of all cats, as if I can't be obvious enough. But let's say I also create lists. You can do something more innovative, I guess, here. And I have this collection that I select, the cat management blueprint, and I save to it. So now, as someone said here, that this was not associated with a collection. So this request is now associated with the collection. So I have get all cats associated. Under here, it's a get request, and now the URL resolves because it's taking the collection variable from here. Now, interestingly, you see that it shows, when you pop over, it shows the initial value and the current value, and it says the scope is collection, so you know that where that value is being injected from. If I create an environment, let's go ahead and create an environment, top right, see this cog thing. It opens the Manage Environments modal, and I click Add. And let's also call it cat management. Let's just call it develop, just for local. And I'm just going to create an identical set of variables in there. But in this case, I would use, let's say, api.cat. And I'm going to leave this empty for now. And I'm going to create another called API key. And I'm going to maybe have some value here. So I'm just creating something the exact same. Now, to start using an environment, you have to switch to that environment and just select that. So now that I have selected the environment that I created, if I hover on this, you see that the scope has changed to environment. So the same variable, the same name, since I have different variables with the same name, the scope resolves, and it picks from the environment instead of collection. So what you can do is then have multiple variants of this. So let's say I can duplicate this environment. I would create, let's say, I have my production, and my production value maybe has an, which I might deploy my configurations with, safely kept passwords, everything. And if I now have two environments and I switch to that environment, this switches my base URL as well. So you can also try using these when you are documenting a request, when you're documenting an API, preferably abstract out the base URL. That way, if the domain changes at some point, or you're pointing to a different host, you can just switch using environments and point to a different source. So yeah, now we have one request, but we don't yet have the body or anything as part of it. So I have not set any authorization. You might often have an authorization requirement of how the API would actually work. So if you need, let's say, an API key-based authentication or a bearer token, you can choose those. And you can define this token here. Or you can also use, I have differences, sorry. Collection variable was API key uppercase. Let's all make it them all lowercase. Okay. Yeah. So let's say you have an API, you're building an API where the consumer needs to call your API with a authorization token, and the token is what they obtain from your dev portal or dashboard, the way you might build it. So you can also use environment variables here in these fields as well. So you don't have to hard code any keys or anything. So just remember this, whenever there is a transient value at any point, you think that the value might change, you should not hard code, but you should use a variable instead. All right, so at this point, I have the authorization set at the request level. But you can also, if you have a common set of authorization for all the requests in your collection, you can also set it at a collection level, and you can make every request inherit the auth. That way, Postman will just make sure that you don't have to redo it. So let's do that. I'm going to use bearer token, and I'm going to create a API key. I'm just going to write it in the collection itself, and I'm going to update the collection. And in case you did not notice, how I opened the edit thing was this view more actions. I clicked that, and then I went to edit. And I came here. So now I have a collection with some authorization information set here. And you also get this useful little green dots, which tell you that you have something different there. So I just selected bearer token. And this depends on what your API endpoint is like. It's not that you have to do it, but you can select the options that come up here. All right, so back to our request. Let's change this to inherit auth from parent, because let's say in our case, all our requests would have the same auth structure. And I save it. Again, you can hit Control S, Command S, and the request gets saved. Now, since this is a GET request, let's say in our case, the thing that this particular endpoint is supposed to return is an array of objects. I'm not going into details like pagination or rate limiting. Those would be more complicated use cases, but real-life use cases, well. So what I want to do is tell my consumers the expected response structure. I have two ways to do that. I could either write that in the request description, like I could have written that, okay, like this request returns something like this. Let's say I want, okay, it's giving me ID and so on. I could have documented it here. So let's say you could theoretically do this. Now, while you have it in this, if I open this in View in Web, it does show up here because it is part of the description. But it's, again, something that is missing a context. So we see a lot of our community use request descriptions to describe how the response would be like. But then Postman has something better. So let's not do it here instead. I'm sorry if someone followed that. That was purposely misleading. And you see this top right, on the top right, there's something called examples, which currently says 0. So if you click the drop down, it says no examples added. Now, examples in Postman are request response examples. So given a request, what would your API respond with? In real life, we have multiple scenarios where, let's say the get all cats might have a response, a success response, where it would return an array of objects. If there are no cats added, it might return an empty array. If you give it a wrong API key, it will give you an access denied error with a 403 header. So you would have all these different scenarios as part of it. So you can document all of that by using examples. And these examples are connected to requests. They are not at a collection level. So every request has its corresponding example. So if you click on the add example, you come to this screen where you are given an example name. This is the name for the example, not the request, the name that you see here. And then you select what the example request looks like, what would be the body or the request headers and request parameters, and what the response body and response headers would look like. Now, this is a manual process because you are statically defining. This is like a form of documentation, you can say. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to use a convention where I name all my examples as a success case or a failure case, because I might also document 403 or 500 error codes for every single request. So I just named it success for get all cats. This is a get request. I'm not using any specific headers. I can say that, okay, the request header can contain content type. I can say that it has content type, and I'm dealing with JSON, so I put that as the value. I'm leaving the description field empty. But the key thing happens in the body field here. So the example response is where I can give it a status code, and I say that I'm writing a status, the response for a 200 OK response. And I'm going to have a JSON response where get all cats, in my case, is going to return an array of objects. And every object would have ID, and let's give it a number. Then I had said it would have a name, and let's call it Lucy. Lucy is actually here today. Then I had decided on a breed, and let's say, what do we call Lucy? Let's call Lucy a black leopard. And age, well, Lucy looks 1. Right. So that was the schema that I had shown. So let me actually bring that screen up. Yeah. So this is what we are building, right? The first route returns list of all cats with the cat schema that we had here, the ID, name, breed, and age, where the ID and age are integers and the name and breed are strings. So back to Postman again, that is what I have. And if you're not used to JSON, just follow along for now, or if you're not comfortable writing it at the pace at which I'm doing. So let's just create a second item and call it cookie. And let's say cookie is a Sphinx cat, but cookie is 5 years old. And then I save it. Now, I have one request example saved, and with a corresponding response. I can also go and put the response headers. For example, sometimes your APIs would send headers saying that you have a rate limitation of these many calls left as part of headers, or information about the next page if it's a paginated response. So you can also mock those in here. And I'll just, again, create the content type, because that's the simplest one to demonstrate. And I'm going to create it here, and again, save the example. All right. Now, if you go back to the tab where the request was there, you would see the example now shows 1, and the success get all cats. I'm going to give it a minute and just make sure that everyone has something in the response body, if you're following along. So if you have not written this complex structure, it's fine. Just you can put something in the response body just so that you can follow it up with. All right. Now, let's look at the docs that are generated for this. So the documentation is constantly synchronized with the collection. So the moment you save the collection, it's associated with an account. Now, you see what happened on the right-hand side here. So the request came up with an example response saying 200 OK, and the content for that is what I had put in the example response. So this is the way that you can get multiple responses created. So let's create a failure scenario. Let's say I want to add another example. So I go back to my request, click the add example from the examples dropdown. And let's say this is a failure scenario, invalid credentials. So invalid credential, maybe you have given something wrong. So I'm going to return a 403 for this use case. And I'm just going to respond with maybe saying message. I need to change this to JSON to make sure it highlights. As a message, give me API keys to munch on. Right. So I haven't changed anything else. My URL structure is still the same. It's for get URL/cats. I have a different body. And I have put the HTTP status code that it is expected to have in the response as 403. So again, remember, I'm designing this. I'm actually not building an API right here. This is being stored as part of my collection. So if I export this collection and send it to someone even as the collection JSON, they'd get these data with it. But if I have someone as part of my team in the same workspace, I don't need to do the export because Postman would already have synced and they would have the chain set available already. All right, so now I have two scenarios that I have created. Let me go and refresh this docs page again. And now you see I've got, in the example area, I've got this listed as well. So if I want to see how the 403 error looks like, I have this documented here. So again, this is something that you can use to brainstorm as well, which means you don't have to necessarily write a static document and then come and start with Postman. But you can start your brainstorming on the API design and collaboration right here, add different request examples, see how they feel like, see how the actual response structure looks like, see if you are able to describe them properly, and stay with that. So one common thing that I'm asked often is how can I add some images in here? So you can't upload an image as part of a collection straight away. But if you have the image hosted somewhere, you can link it just like you would link a regular Markdown. Let's say you would have the alt text and you would have the image URL. So you could just add some Markdown images in that way. I don't think this actually exists, so it might error out. Yeah, that image is broken. But once you add any image in there, Postman will be able to render it. So you can use this to add your architectural diagrams that you might have to explain what happens in the request, which again, you might need to host it somewhere else. There is a cool hack that I can show you after the workshop because I don't want to distract people from it, on how you can actually serve these images from the collection itself. All right. So, yes?
So you don't see the response headers in the online documentation?
You don't see the response headers in the online documentation? So I have the request. Oh, you were talking of the response headers, right? Where did it go? Sorry. where is the response headers? Ooh, let me get back to you on that. Sorry? Yeah, yeah. Not in this one, didn't I? Oh, I didn't add here. That's why it's not showing up. Oh. Right. So what you are seeing here happen is, you have these repetitive headers that you need to keep on adding because they are part of everything, and then you forget to add them. So just to save from scenarios like these is why you have this concept of preset headers in Postman. So this is something that you can create if you just reuse the same set of headers again and again. So if you go to any request tab, go to headers, and you would see there is this presets thing. You could go to manage presets, create your set of preset headers, and then every time you're creating a request, you can just select that, and it would auto-populate based on.
Presets are have to be in a collection.
No, presets are stored to your local thing. Yeah, it's like a snippet for yourself that you've created. Yes?
How do you navigate to this online?
How do I navigate to the online documentation? So you click this small thing beside the collection arrow, and you click the view in web. Or you can go to the browse view, which is bottom. So Postman has these two views, build and browse. And if you go to the browse view, you can go to the collection, click on it, it would go to the same page. Or you can just log into your team's domain, and you would be able to see this in the dashboard itself for the workspace. So there are all these different ways that you can access it, but I'll go back to the build mode. So while you are working with collection, the easiest way would be to just click the popover and click view in web. OK, so synced. Yes, synced.
One more question.
Yes, sir?
The authorization bearer token
Uh-huh.
in the docs, how does the user know that they need to pass that?
You're saying, like, since I added the authorization here. So this would be the information that's given here. Like in the documentation itself, you would see it mentioned that this request requires authentication. But Postman is not going to show this explicitly up here. So that is where the thing I mentioned, that you would want to describe how the authorization is supposed to work. So tell people that, get this API key, put it in this environment variable if you're using. Just guide people around how exactly they would put it. But since you have it as part of your collection, everyone has the same behavior attached to them. And yeah, so you can also add comments at a request and a collection level here, which if you're part of a team, I can say that please remove the broken image and leave it at that. And this also, if you comment here, it gets synchronized with the app here. So at the request level, I also have the comments, which in the newer versions would be above the send button, but now it's below the send button. And it synchronizes. So this is not stored as part of your collection itself, but people need to use Postman to be able to view it, or at least they need to be signed into your team to see these comments. And you can also tag your team members. So yeah, let's say Bruce Wayne. Yep. And this also triggers a notification. So you can just, I would say don't use this to chat with your team members, but just use this to pinpoint. I mean, we never know. We often get surprised by the different use cases that people use Postman for. I just met a friend of mine who showed me that he's managing his blog using Postman. He's got a collection to just create new posts. So he writes his markdown. I don't know how he manages to write in that editor. and he has a Gatsby backend, so he just pushes, triggers a Gatsby build, which deploys to production. I mean, Postman as a blogging tool, I hadn't thought of it. These things kind of keep on coming a lot. So if you are chatting there, well, history is going to be difficult for now, but we have plans to improve that. All right, so we have one request with two examples, one failure, one success scenario, one that responds with a 403 status code, one responds with a 200 status code. So now, let's add the second request, which was, let's look at the spec. We want a post/cats, and it adds a new cat. So what we want to do is create a new request in that collection with the method changed to post. The URL stays the same because we'll just use the base URL with the variable /cats. And then we'll add a body to it. So what we can do is we can hit Control-T or Command-T, create a new empty tab, or you can create a new request from the modal as well. So feel free to start on it already. So create a new request. This is not an exercise, but just feel free to do it. All right. So I'm just going to create another URL/cats, and I'm changing the method to post. And I'll save it. I'll name it add a cat. I'm going to call it create a new one. Now, at this point, it also took my existing collection because I created the new tab from that collections context. So Postman retains these contexts throughout. So let me save it there. All right, so I now have a second request, which again maps to my API's endpoints on how they were supposed to be. But what I would have different this time is I have, since this is a post request, and let's say we are talking of a JSON-based API here. So I'm going to add a body, so a request body to it, which would be the payload that would be sent as part of this request, or this is what it would accept. Now, what I'm doing, and some of you might have noticed, is I'm actually not using Postman as an API client, but I'm using it to build a collection with requests which maps to another API. So I'm kind of designing how an existing API or how a different API looks like. But I can, of course, run these, which I'll show you in a while. So for now, we're just creating the requests. So let's go ahead, select the body, switch to raw. If you don't like JSON, you can use GraphQL. Feel free to use that as well, but anything as long as you are building it. And in this case, I want my body to have, well, ID. And my ID is a number, so I'm going to call it cat. Oh, wait, I'm creating one, so I don't need an ID. So when I'm creating, my API would need just the name, breed, and age, and it would create an ID for me typically of the entry and return me the ID, if that's the scenario. So I'm going to pass it a name. And I can, at this point, hard code. So let's say Ninja is the name. I have a breed. Let's say breed is Persian. And let's call it age is 12. And yeah, cats can live that long. I had this huge conversation yesterday around how long cats live. Now, so what I did was I hard-coded a body in there. So if I had sent this request somewhere, this would have been the exact payload that would go in that post request. So this is all good when I am writing, when I'm maybe using it to just quickly debug a request. But can anyone tell me what's the problem if you're designing it this way? Yes, sir?
You hard-coded the values.
I have hard-coded the values, exactly, which I already said. But the problem being?
That you want them to change, you want to indicate to people that they should fill it in.
The change, or when I want to indicate another value. Mm-hmm. Were you saying something, sir? In the back? I saw you briefly raise hand.
I was just going to
Yeah, so essentially the problem right now, if I, and this is not wrong. So whatever I'm showing here is not wrong. You already have a request, you have documented, fine. But let's make it more usable for the consumers or for even yourself as you go ahead. So I know that the things in my request body that would not change would be the keys of the properties, because I want it to have a name, or let's say the API I'm building, it needs to have a name, breed, and age. What would be changing would be the values. So if I hard code a value here, anyone who's using this collection, or even if I want to test with another set of data, I'll have to edit this, which edits the collection and actually changes the value. What I can do is I can use a variable here. So let's call it underscore cat name. And since I put it in a double curly brace, let's also do the same for the breed. So I'm just using the underscore because these are my temporary values. You can choose not to use the underscore. You can use camel casing, snake casing. And for the age, however, I'm not going to use the double quotes because the way Postman stores variable values is a string. So all variable values, the data type is a string. If you want to store any rich form of data, let's say you want to store a JSON data in a variable, or you want to store a JavaScript object in general, you would have to serialize it into a string and store it. And that's a very common approach, that when you are saving data between requests into an environment, it would, the next workshop has a lot more of these, but just to give you a brief, it's completely fine to do a JSON.stringify in JavaScript and store that. And when you want to use that value, you get the environment value and do JSON.parse and actually convert it back to the JavaScript object. So in this case, the age is a number. And since the string that is storing it, the variable that is storing that value would have a string, I don't want it to output within string itself. So I might just put 12 as a number. So when it comes in the body, it gets substituted, and it does not get the quotes around it. So what we have here right now is a body, a request body, where I have made the values as variables. So what I can do now is, if I want to change, let's go back to our environment. I click Manage Environment, go to Develop. I can create these values. So I had what, cat name. And let's say my cat name is, what is my cat name? Suggest a cat name, please.
Fluffy.
Sorry?
Fluffy.
Fluffy. Oh. Thank you. You're so nice people. If you had left the naming to me, it wouldn't have been so good. Breed. Favorite breeds, anyone? Let's just call it Indie. All right. And age. 7. All right. I don't know why I chose that. So what I have done now is my environment, which you can click this small eye icon to have a quick view into what your environment table looks like. So my environment at this point has got all these 3 ones. The request body at this point does not resolve it the way you have it resolved in the values, but there is something else I wanted to show you. We have this thing called the Postman console, bottom left. You see this console thing, the third most icon. When you click that, you open up, let's not make it big. You open up this teeny little console, which is similar to how your dev tools in browsers are. What Postman does is provides additional context behind every single request that is being sent. So let's say currently this is pointing to some weird place. So let's just hit send. And I could not get any response, but at least it logs the, oh, I did not have something. Wait, let me put. All right. So let's hit the send again. Okay. So what I see here in the console is that Postman now shows that it has sent api.cat/cat. So it resolved the variable. And I see that the request headers that were sent, I see the request body. And in the request body, I see that the name and everything were actually resolved. So the exact result that I wanted. Now, if I want to change the value, if I want to maybe send a different name, all I need to do is edit the current value. And let's say call it Mini. I decided to change the name of my cat. So I send it again, look at the console, look at the request body, and I see the request body that was sent was Mini. Yes.